Okay,
Can I ask a question?
yes, quick question?
In my exposure, I have found that whether it's the way I was brought up or the way Jews are brought up, that we are much more capable of asking questions without feeling there's going to be repercussions.
So the question is, are Jews more able to ask questions than others? And it depends on what the questions are.
Well,
My father grew up in an Orthodox community, and he asked questions that got him in trouble. So it's not all Jews. It's not all styles of Judaism.
So the way I was brought up. But my Catholic friends and my Christian friends are inhibited from
Well,
asking
there
questions.
are some religious cultures that are more open to debate and discussion, and others that are less so.
So does
And
the
so that
outcome-
one of the speculations is that Jewish culture, in fact, has encouraged a kind of secularization because it's willing to let people ask questions, it's trying to find reasons for things, and sometimes the reasons lead you in a different direction.
So does that influence the statistics?
Sure, that makes sense. It's certainly possible. There's a lot of factors too. Remember, Jews are more educated than the general population. They are more likely to have college degrees and advanced degrees, and there's a strong correlation between having an advanced degree and being secular. Jews are much more urban than the general population compared to rural populations. There's a correlation to being urban and being more secular. Jews tend to be higher earners than the average mean income, and there's a correlation to higher income and being secularized. Jews tend to be more politically liberal, and there's a correlation to being politically liberal and being more secularized. So there's a lot of factors that would encourage us sociologically to be more secularized. Jewish culture is one of them, but it's also income, education, residence patterns, political allegiance, and so on. So there's a lot of factors that lead us to where we are today. Okay, so we're turning now to talk about our approach to the Torah and the Bible. And this is a particularly challenging one for some of us because some people actually become secular by reading the Bible. They say, I'm going to read what this is all about. Not just the quotes that people cite all the time, or the nice stories, or Joseph and his brothers, and Abraham and Isaac. Let's read the whole thing. And the more they read, the less they agree with what they find. I mean, there are some beautiful things to be found there. Some of the ethics that are described in Leviticus are wonderful. Have an equal set of weights and measures so you don't cheat people. Don't pervert justice either for the poor or for the rich, but judge everyone equally. Do not withhold a worker's wages overnight so they're captive to you. You think of sharecropping, wage slavery, all kinds of examples where the owners oppress the workers by withholding what was rightfully the workers. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do not oppress the stranger because you were a stranger in Egypt. And on and on. Plenty of wonderful ethics. That's in Leviticus 19. But if you read Leviticus 18, which is the chapter before, this is actually one of the prescribed readings for one of the high holiday services. It describes all the forbidden sexual relations that you are allowed to practice. It does not prohibit an uncle marrying a niece, by the way. And it certainly condemns people wearing clothing of the other gender, or a man who lies with a man as with a woman. That is condemned and they should be killed. This is not part of our value system today, for many of us, and hopefully for more and more of us. This is a case where in adjacent chapters we have wonderful ethics that we find valuable and we have problematic ethics. So that's one challenge for us if we're going to approach the Torah or the Bible and say this is ours. But I don't like some parts of it. And I find other parts disturbing but insightful. For example, the story of Noah. Ethically, it's very problematic. After all, when God says to Noah, I'm going to destroy everybody and everything, does Noah say, why? Does Noah say, no? Does Noah say, how many can I save? Noah says, how big should I build my boat? He doesn't argue. At least Abraham, when they're contemplating destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, argues with God. He negotiates down to 10. If I can only find 10 good people, will you save it? And God finally says, okay. But Noah says nothing. And God destroys the world because of the corruption that he himself could have prevented. What did all those other kangaroos do? Sometimes you get a sensitive kid that thinks about the third cow and the third lion that didn't make it on the boat. Not to mention the babies of people. So ethically, it's very problematic. But is there something in the human heart that has that kind of reaction to corruption and disaster that says, I'm going to wipe the slate clean, I'm just going to clear it all off? On some level, God is like somebody drafting something and they say, oh, this is terrible, they crumple it up, they want to throw it away and start over all over again. There's an insight into the human condition there. But we have to find a way to approach it that reflects the complex relationship we have with it. That we find some valuable, we find some problematic, and we don't find it as a verbatim version of history. I mentioned the example of Lot and his daughters, right? That's not history, that's ideology. If we want the history of the Ammonites, we have to go somewhere else. For that matter, if we want the history of the Israelites, we can look at the Bible, but we also need archaeology and other sources, and our own rational mind, thinking through what makes sense and what doesn't. So in many communities, there was a debate, even in my own congregation when it founded before I was there, do we want a Torah scroll? Yes, we can read Bible stories, we'll teach them in Sunday school, but do we want the actual scroll? And if we have a scroll, what do we do with it? How do we treat it? After all, in a traditional congregation, it's treated as more than just a book. When the ark is open, you stand up. When you recite the Shema facing the open ark, you cover your eyes. It's decorated not just with a cover, but with crowns and jewels. When it's carried around the building, everyone kisses it in a remote way because you can't touch it yourself. You touch your prayer shawl, you use your prayer book. You dance with it on Simchat Torah. You treat it, to be candid, almost like an idol. It's what you call Toralatry. You bow to it. Well, that sometimes feels uncomfortable for people who self-define as secular or humanistic Jews, both because they've read it, or read more of it, and also because they feel like that's part of that sort of worship attitude that our sense of self and self-dignity doesn't lend itself to. Now, when the Birmingham Temple, the first humanistic congregation, built its building, they did not put an ark in the sanctuary. Instead, they built a special niche for the Torah scroll in the library. Their perspective was, it's a book, so it belongs with the books. Now, it was not listed in the cart catalog. You could not check it out. It was on extreme reference. But it was with the other books, in a special place, specially displayed, and they had book versions of it on the shelf as well, but the Torah was put with the other books. In my community, they had a tradition of having a Torah in an ark, and of having people stand when we took the Torah out of the ark. I came from a community that had the Torah in the library. And I didn't like the idea of doing the Torah parade. And even my community, if they had people stand for the Torah coming out, we didn't do the parade. So what I decided to do, and it's been well received by the community as well, is we do ask people to stand for the Torah. I ask them, I don't tell them. So if they choose to stay seated, that's up to them. And I also put other books into the ark. So the Torah is a book. It's a special book. It's the earliest book that we have of Jewish literary creativity. We find value in it in a lot of ways, even if only as an artifact of what our people believed and thought. And that's why we stand for it as a sign of respect. But it is not the only book in the Jewish library that we value. We might put books of modern poetry, books of philosophy, books of science in our ark. If you were making your own ark, what books would you put in it that have had a profound impact on your life? I like to say that our ark is wider. We can include more than just the Torah. After all, if all you do is study the Torah, you're missing out on a lot, even in the rest of the Bible. If you only read the Torah, it goes from creation to Moses dying. They haven't even entered the promised land. That's following. That's in the sequel, Book of Joshua. You don't read anything about King David or Solomon, none of the Psalms, no Proverbs, no Ruth or Esther or Deborah. All that's later in the Bible. If all you do is Torah, 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 then it's a limited cycle of study. So I try to broaden our sense of literature. For our high holidays, we'll often do a Torah reading for the evening service, and then the morning service I'll pick a piece of modern Jewish literature that comments or responds in some way to that theme that's highlighted in the Torah reading. I'm also not confined to the assigned Torah readings for the high holidays. So I don't have to read the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac, every single year. I can find something else that opens up a conversation I want to have. One year I even chose some of the obnoxious texts in Leviticus 18 and said, I used it as a lesson, a teaching point. You should know this is in there. And you should think about the fact that if this was printed in the front page of your newspaper, you wouldn't stand for it. But in the synagogue, we just stood for it. And what does that mean? How do we understand that concept? Again, it should be a more complex relationship with the text and have a sense that it's broader. So when I do that modern literature reading in the morning service, that book goes in the ark also. We take the Torah out as a symbol, and we then take the book out we're reading as part of the service. When our Bar and Bat Mitzvah students are choosing what they want to do for their presentations, they can choose a Torah reading if they want to, but they can choose a Torah reading. They're not assigned by the portion for the week of their event. So no one gets stuck with leprosy unless they want to talk about leprosy, or menstrual impurity, or any of the other categories. Many of them choose sibling stories because they have that experience in their life. I had one student who was fascinated by the concept of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He did a wonderful presentation on the death penalty. It had nothing to do with the date of his event, but it was a Torah reading that he responded to. Again, our ark is wider for Bar and Bat Mitzvah students too. So some of them choose a reading from later in the Bible, the book of Esther or Samson, or the Samson stories in the book of Judges. We've had students do the book of Job because they're interested in that question. That's great. It's a wider ark. Or they might even choose a topic from out of the whole sweep of the Jewish experience and do a research project on a person or an issue or an idea. I had one student who did the topic of synagogue architecture because he was interested in architecture, and so he researched the history of the synagogue and what you design, what you put where. He designed his own synagogue and talked about why he designed it the way that he did. It was a wonderful project that explored his Jewish heritage, and we found a Hebrew reading that fit with the theme of his talk. But again, it was a wider arc, understanding that Torah as teaching can be more than just Torah as the written book. And we do approach it as many categories of intellectual content. It can be history, and we have to parse it appropriately. It can be literature, and then we think about it differently than history. And it can be ethics and values, but we don't have to agree with everything. We're allowed to argue with that too. We'll talk more about that in the afternoon. So that's, in a nutshell, our approach to the Torah, the Bible, and to some extent rabbinic literature as well. After all, if we were to read the Talmud, we would find some wonderful teachings in there, and we would find a lot of stuff that felt very irrelevant to what we were doing. We might find interesting stories and narratives, and we would find detailed discussions over how far you're allowed to travel on Shabbat, and by what means. I actually started, there's a process of study, started in the 1920s, called the Daf Yomi, which means the daily page. And the idea is, if you study one page of Talmud a day, based on the standard Vilna printing edition, you could get through the whole thing in 7.5 years. Gives you a sense of how long it is. And so I actually started this a couple of cycles ago to start studying. I made the mistake of starting it just after my daughter was born, not realizing, of course, that my time was not my own anymore. And I got through the first tractate on Barachot fine, I got through the second one on Shabbat, and the third one in that cycle is called Eruvin, which is defining the Eruv. This is that concept that you can create a fictional courtyard around a larger space that allows you to carry things or wear things that you wouldn't be allowed to wear in a public space. There's rules about what you can take from a private space to a public space and back. About halfway through Eruvin, I ran out of gas because there were too few needles for the amount of haystack I had to get through. In Brachot and Shabbat, it was the needle to haystack ratio was a little bit better, but as I got into Eruvin, and I've been now receiving an email summary of the daily page for a couple of years. We just got through the whole section, or a brain, or emotions, or a hand, or a finger. God as a character is much more interesting. But it's a different approach. And so if I read the story about God as a character, that's one thing. The challenge becomes, what do we do with celebrating Jewish life? This gets to the question that was raised last night today, and I'm sure will be continued to be discussed for many, many months in this community, the question of the texts of celebration, the blessings, the traditional prayers, and specifically texts called the Shema and the Kaddish. What do we do with those traditional pieces? Now, again, in Reform or Reconstructionist settings, they may not believe the literal meaning of a king, a you male, a divine sovereignty over the world that actually intervenes in the world, as the text says. And so they go into the redefinition project. In the footnotes, in the translation, they try to soften it a bit by working around. They might say, well, when I say God, I mean love. Or when I say God, I mean the highest in humanity. And that's one strategy and approach that allows you to keep the traditional words as long as you don't try to substitute that for everything. You know, if God is a force in the world, like gravity, if I said, blessed are you gravity, it feels different than saying, blessed are you God. They like that the God has the old associations as well as the new definitions they've given it. We've chosen a different route to change it, or to substitute, or to not do it at all. These are three different strategies to how to approach something like a Shema or a Kaddish or a traditional blessing. Option one is adaptation. Make some slight changes so you can use the old melody, so you can say most of the old words, but you can, say what you believe in the English and the Hebrew and feel consistent in that. You get that satisfaction of consistent ideology and practice. As one example, in my community, they were very attached to the traditional melody to Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Now the words of the traditional Avinu Malkeinu are asking for God to fix everything. That isn't a very humanistic sentiment. So I decided we needed to shift the words a bit, and instead we sing Asinu Chalkeinu. We create our portion, our lot in life. And we do that despite the floods and the plagues and all the things that God's supposed to save us from in the original. Now we do it ourselves despite this challenge. Instead of calling for God to hear our voice, we call to each other, let us hear what we are saying now and then live it out in the world. It works to the same Barbra Streisand uplifting melody, but you have a slight substitution to the words. And we've done that. We had in our service last night the song Na'aseh Shalom. Instead of saying Oseh Shalom, he makes peace, we often sing in our communities, Na'aseh Shalom, we make peace. Instead of just Al Kol Yisrael, among all Israel, we say Al Kol Ha'olam, for all the world. And at the end, instead of saying Amen, which is sort of a passive I agree, we sing Shalom because it's a peace that we've made. Now, changing Avinu Malkeinu, changing Oseh Shalom to Na'aseh Shalom, that's not as controversial. It's when you get to the Holy of Holies, the Shema, the Kaddish, the basic blessing formula, that it gets more controversial. So doing an adapted version of a Shema or a Kaddish, for some people, works. They get the melody, they get the associations, they feel moved by it. It's like a jazz riff on an old melody, or a rhapsody on a theme by Paganini. It's creative response. It's in dialogue with the past, but doing something different. For other people, it feels like a Weird Al Yankovic parody song. You're being disrespectful. How can you change that? You don't have the right to change. All those martyrs that died with the Shema on their lips, and now you're changing it? It's like singing, I bless America. It just feels off, or disrespectful, or problematic. And then, so that's one option, is to, if you like the change, it works. If it doesn't fit with your sentiment, it just feels off, that's a problem. So that's the adapted response. The second response is a substitute response. Let me find another poem, or even write another piece that gets at what I'm trying to get at. Some of you may know that the Kaddish itself does not talk about the dead. We'll have a chance to look at the text in a bit. But people associate it with the dead because they never go to services. If they went to daily services, they hear the Kaddish all the time. But because they go to funerals, they hear the Kaddish at the funeral. And it's associated with burial and mourning and death. There's a lot of poetry about death and mourning and loss. And maybe some of that poetry, even Israeli poetry about that topic, will evoke those emotions, will meet that need in a substitute way. So one option is adapting the old text, another is find something else to substitute that meets that emotional, ceremonial need. And the third option would be to say, well, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to have a central statement of what we believe. We'll talk about it in other ways. We'll say we agree to disagree on topics. We have a variety of perspectives in our community, so we don't need a Shema. Maybe we don't have a Shema section in the service at all. And we do other things. Our theme is on time. Our theme is on beauty. Our theme is on hope. And we'll find readings and poems that relate to that. And we don't have to have a Shema section or a Kaddish section in the service. So those are the three possible approaches we could have taken to liturgy. The redefinition, which is what other movements have done. The adaptation, the substitute, or let's just move on and not talk about it. So I want to take a look at a couple examples of these, but first I want to show you a short video. This is by the well-known Jewish cultural group Monty Python. Again, I'm sorry for the buzz, but when the show starts it'll work. This is an example of what they call an honest prayer.
Let us praise God. Oh Lord. Oh, you are so big. So absolutely good. Gosh, we're all really impressed down here, I can tell you. We're all really impressed down here, I can tell you. Forgive us, O Lord, for this our dreadful toadying. But you're so strong and well, just so super. Lord, please don't burn us, don't kill daughters, your love.
Get the idea. And you know, that's again the challenge of if you know what you're saying. If you read the traditional liturgy in Hebrew and you read the translation of it, a lot of it is one of three modes. There's either praise, petition, or gratitude. It's like saying, please, 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 or praise, 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 or thank you, thank you, thank you. And often it appears in a certain formula. You say, praise, praise, please, thank you, thank you. Now this works on people too, by the way. So if I said to you, John, you're so wonderful and so talented, could you please help me with just this one issue? Thank you very much, you're so wonderful. So you just mix up the praise, the please, and the thank you, and you can get what you want. Well, that's the meaning of it, you see. And part of the challenge is, many of us don't understand the Hebrew. So that either opens up the possibility of saying things we don't believe, or the challenge of feeling alienated by saying things I don't know what I'm saying. And it works in both ways. Some people also make a distinction between what you're saying and what you're singing. How many of you have ever sung Christmas carols? Sure. Did it matter that you didn't believe that Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day? God rest ye merry gentlemen. Well, for some it did. In fact, people remember in the 1950s when you had Christmas pageants in schools. If it was a very Jewish school, the volume would drop precipitously during the carol at certain words. Right? So, you know, you could hear the volume go down when they were saying certain things. But we know those songs. We know the words to those songs. Does it really matter if I'm singing in the car to a particular Christmas carol or not? For some it would, for some it wouldn't. Then apply that to a community setting, and we're trying to affirm what we believe and celebrate what we think. Does it matter what we're saying, or if we're singing it, does the fact that we're together, does that supersede? Is that more important? Can we treat Yitgadal v'Yitgadash Shemei Rabbah, the beginning of the Kaddish, like bim bam biddy biddy bam? Does it matter? Because bim bam doesn't matter. Should Yitgadal be, maybe that's just the rhythm, the sounds, the nonsense syllables. Or maybe it does have a meaning. So let me take us through a couple examples. This is in the packet here. Okay. So again, the traditional formula that you are familiar with, Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you our Lord, Eloheinu melech haolam, our God, Lord of the universe, or King of the universe. And then you'd have either a verb, borei pri hagafen, who brings forth the fruit of the vine, or sometimes Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us with his commandments, v'tzivanu, and commanded us to light Hanukkah candles, or Shabbat candles, or eat matzah, or whatever the issue would be. So this is an example of an adapted text that works to the traditional melody. As I showed last night with the motzi, a bread blessing, this is for a wine blessing. You could sing this. Baruch haor ba'olam, Baruch haor ba'adam, borei pri hagafen, the traditional melody. And you might even end l'chaim. If you don't want to say amen, you can say l'chaim, and then you've got a Jewish experience in a humanistic key, but with the traditional melody, for those who are familiar with or who want to pass that on. So this is an example of an adapted text. And again, some of you might say, wonderful. And some of you might say, blech, because it's not what I'm used to. One of the challenges we've set ourselves as a movement is sometimes one of the few things people actually remember from their Hebrew school learning is Baruch atah Adonai, and we're telling them, don't do that. We're making them change that. So it takes a little bit of extra work. Now, another example that was in the service last night for the wine blessing is this text, which is a substitute. It uses a line from the traditional Birkat HaMazon, that Savri Marnan V'Rabbanan phrase, appears in the traditional blessing after meals. In this case, it's deployed for the Kiddush, the wine blessing before, but it is a substitute text. It's a new melody, it's new words, and so that's another option. If you don't like the adapted version, you could try a substitute version for a blessing like that. Here's another version. This is by Rabbi Judith Seid, who wrote one of the poems in the service last night as well. And she goes even more off the map. She says, Ashreinu b'Yerushatenu, shemasra lanu kos pri hagafen, l'moadimu l'simcha, ki samachnu b'chagenu. We rejoice in our heritage, which has given us the cup of wine as a symbol of our rejoicing. And in this case, she's taken basically an English text she wants to say and then reverse engineered it back into the Hebrew. That's another option. You could go that way. You could use Yiddish as a language for blessing too. My mother, remembers, she grew up in a Sholem Aleichem Yiddish shula in Detroit, and they had a song they would sing at holiday time called Mir Benchen die Licht, which is We Bless the Lights. Mir Benchen die Licht, Mir Benchen die Licht, L'kov Adem Heiligen Yom Tov. We bless the lights in honor of the holy holiday, Yom Tov, this holiday. So you could have something in Yiddish that would fill the Jewish niche, need, and nostalgia, but also express what you're trying to say. So those are some examples for blessings. Here's again one for Hanukkah. This one works to the traditional Hanukkah melody. And again, there's two versions here. Here's one that's a combination of English and Hebrew. Baruch ha'or ba'olam, Baruch ha'or ba'adam. We light these candles in our home tonight, and we hope that in the world light will shine for all. So it's a way of expressing what you think in Hebrew and in English, so accessible to both, and in the traditional melody without the commandedness and commandment. So again, it'll work for some, it won't work for others. That's part of the challenge. Now, on the subject of blessing, one other thing I wanted to highlight is there's a difference between what a community does together and what individuals may choose to do for themselves. So I remember working at the Birmingham Temple in Detroit. There was a family there. They'd been members of the congregation for 30 years, raised all their kids, served on the board, worked for the staff. They chose, when they were raising their kids, to do both humanistic blessings and the traditional blessings at home, because they wanted their kids to be familiar with both when they lit Hanukkah candles. Who knows where they would wind up? That was an important value for them. It doesn't mean that the community did both. The community did what everybody shared, which was the humanistic approach. And we'll talk more about this when it comes to theology tomorrow. But when it comes to blessings and ritual practice, just because you're part of a secular or humanistic Jewish community doesn't ban you from ever saying these words on your own or in your own space. It just means the community as a whole won't necessarily have everyone do that together. I had a member of my congregation, actually. His mother is now 102 years old. And he came to me, he said, I love the congregation, I fully agree with what we stand for. I know that when my mother dies, she will want me to say the Kaddish for her. The traditional Kaddish, not a humanistic version, not some adaptation. She wants the one that she knows and values. And I want to do that for her. But I don't want to feel like a hypocrite or an inauthentic person. I said to him, well, here's a way to think about it. First of all, you're in your space, not our space. That's one way to say you're free to do what you choose to do. A second way to think about it is your family will ask you for favors all the time. Some favors might feel like too much. If she said, in my memory, I want you to keep kosher, you might say, I'm sorry, that's asking more than I'm willing to do. But if she asks you to recite the text and you're willing to do that, that's fine. And I would also encourage you to think about what you might need to say for yourself in memory of her. So if you're saying the Kaddish as she would have wanted you to say it, maybe find a modern poem or some other expression that's what you need to say for yourself at her grave as you remember her on her yahrzeit, her death anniversary. So it can be a supplementary approach. It can be both and in a private context that may be different than in the congregational setting. So that might be a strategy to think about in the community setting, that there are ways to get that emotional attachment met in your family setting that may be different from the congregational setting. May work, may not, but it's worth a discussion in any case. And the last piece that I wanted to, let's take a look at the Kaddish text, which I think I have here as well. Yes. Okay, so here we have the text of the traditional Kaddish. Glorified and sanctified be God's great name throughout the world which He has created according to His will. May He establish His kingdom in your lifetime and during your days, and within the life of the entire house of Israel, speedily and soon, and say Amen. May His great name be blessed forever into all eternity. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, extolled and honored and lauded be the name of the Holy One, beyond all the blessings, hymns, and praises and consolations that are ever spoken in the world. Amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and for all Israel. He who creates peace in His heights, may He create peace for us and all Israel, and say Amen. So you'll notice, no deceased, no mourning, no funeral. It's not part of the text at all. And as I said, the Kaddish is a regular part of the daily service. It's actually like the intermission. You finish the Shema, you do the Kaddish. You finish the standing prayer of the Amidah, you do a Kaddish. It's like the break in between sections. And it's just a praise of God. There's actually more than one version of the Kaddish. There's a full Kaddish, there's what's called a Chetzi Kaddish, the half Kaddish. There's the Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish. And there's the mourner's Kaddish, which is what people are most familiar with. And they know that rhythm, Yitgadal, Yitgadash, or for those used to the Ashkenazi pronunciation, Yiskadal, Yiskadash. It just becomes a rhythm and a routine, and they just recite it in passing. So how do we approach that issue? Because again, in a communal setting, we might not want to use the traditional words because we don't believe what they mean, and it might alienate part of the community. But there's a need for some kind of marking of memorial. Even in our service last night, we had a memorial section to reflect on the power of memory and loss. In that case, we used an English passage to introduce the conversation. But here are some alternatives that have been created. Here is a humanistic version of the Kaddish in an Aramaic text. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shlomo ba'alma. So here it's praising not Shemei Rabbah, the great name, it's praising peace in the world. And so we made peace reign, and we praise peace beyond all praise. The peace that we seek, the peace the deceased has found. And so it has the rhythm, it has the cadence. I'll just read the first couple lines. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shlomo ba'alma. Nivra shlomo chiritana v'namlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chay dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala v'yizman kari v'imru shalom. And for those familiar with the Kaddish, it sounds very similar to the traditional text, but again with words that we believe. That's the slight adjustment version. And the English translation also you're not embarrassed to have to read out loud in front of people. Now, another version written by Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, who was the Rabbi Emeritus of the City Congregation in New York. It's called a modern Kaddish, but it's also the glory of life. And this one speaks more directly to the actual process of loss. May the glory of life be extolled, everyone says, l'chaim, to life. May the world be blessed with peace, all life hallowed with love and respect, l'chaim. Let life be blessed and glorified, exalted, and honored. You hear echoes of the traditional one, right, in the wording, but we're saying l'chaim, l'chaim every time. And near the end, may peace embrace us, all Israel and all the world. May peace be granted to us, we who mourn, and be a comfort to all who are bereaved, and let us say l'chaim, life at the end. Another version I included in the packet starts with the Kadal v'Kadash phrase, but here it is, Nit Kadal v'Nit Kadash. Let us be sanctified, let us be praised and exalted. Baruch ha'adam, in the spirit of humanity. And then the rest of the text is in English. So again, these are approaches to Kaddish that may work for different individuals or for communities. And the last one is a poem that you could do entirely in Hebrew or in English, or both, by Leah Goldberg, called Remembrance of the Beginning of Things. And I love this poem because it repeats this phrase, Zachor Nizkor, we will surely remember. In a traditional setting, you'd have a Yizkor service, he remembers. In a humanistic context, we have a Nizkor service, we remember. And that we find much more relevant and meaningful. In the end, and I want to make sure we have a little bit of time left for, oh, we have till 12:30, not till 12. Oh, good. Got more time than I thought. All right, so then let me do this. One last thought on blessings, text, liturgy, and then I want to open for comments and questions, and then I have one more topic to cover before our break. I once was doing a funeral, and after the funeral, the woman came up to me and said, why do you have to have a separate humanistic Judaism? Isn't all Judaism humanistic? And I was in a rush, and I maybe wasn't as nice as I could have been, but I said to her, have you ever read the English side of the prayer book? I mean, the wording is not humanistic. What it's saying at a literal level is not humanistic. And what we've tried to do in shifting the language, in articulating our Judaism in a humanistic key, is a change in focus. People sometimes imagine a humanistic Jewish service is like a CIA redacted document, where you've just taken the traditional prayer book and blotted out things with a big black marker and, you know, blessed are you, who and doesn't That's not how it works. We've changed the focus. So as I said last night, instead of focusing up and above and beyond, we focus on each other, on this world, and we focus inside ourselves. And that's not necessarily inconsistent with some parts of Jewish tradition. You may know the story that on Yom Kippur, traditionally, you're not supposed to ask for divine forgiveness until you receive forgiveness from those whom you have offended. And then you can ask for divine forgiveness later. So we like that emphasis on human action, human forgiveness, human community building. And then we shift the beyond to within. Part of our Yom Kippur observance in our community is about learning to forgive yourself. There are times that others may have let it go a long time ago. And we continue to beat ourselves up for this failing, and we don't want to give ourselves cheap grace and just say, oh yeah, I'm forgiven, check, easy. But we do want to create a space that we can evaluate and let go, and release ourselves, write ourselves in the book of life, turn the page for a new chapter. That's part of that change in focus, that re-emphasizing things differently. So if in our blessings we don't want to talk about a God above and beyond, we want to talk about the Borim, the people who bring forth the fruit of the vine. The world that helps us live in that key. And we're not the only ones who have done that. So I included in this packet a wonderful poem. Here we go. It's called Blessed Are You, World, Baruch Atah Olam. And this author describes an experience he had when he visited a kibbutz. It's actually a kibbutz. It's on our itinerary for the Israel trip. See that segue? The archives of Beit HaShita, which is this kibbutz that collected all these kibbutz celebrations from all over Israel. And so here he describes this experience and a lesson he learns from it. In the archives of kibbutz Beit HaShita, I discovered forgotten handwritten notes for a Passover Seder from 1927. Instead of the Kiddush, the author wrote, Baruch Atah Kibbutz, Blessed Are You Kibbutz. In his footsteps I widen the blessing circle, and I say, blessed are you, world, to praise your fragile, complex beauty. If you call the earth your mother who birthed you in pain from the wombs of the mothers from Eve until now, if you call the world your friend who upholds joy, you, whether in day of trouble or of joy, if you call the universe your helpmeet, who gives strength to both your weakness and your might, then join with me in these songs, and we'll sing together in a world that fills our springs with blessings. Planet orbiting the sun from time's beginning till its end, planet blue, green, and white, planet covered with water and land and sky, planet made of forests, lakes, and seas, fields, and sandy beaches, planet Earth that we have seen from space, complete and alive before our astonished eyes. Like the enthusiastic kibbutznik who insisted on making his time new, let us make new what's old and make holy what's new, and join what's called secular to what's called holy, and what's called material to what's called spiritual, until the gulf between them disappears. From Einstein and his students I learned that the elements in me were forged from the same furnace as the stars. From the other great ones I've learned to sit, breathe, pay attention with watchful eyes to a world filled with glory and wonders like me, like you, and like the stars. O blessed world, you give us each day visions and problems to solve and to praise. Now the world isn't listening, but it's okay in a poetic sense to talk about the world as a you, to talk about the sun as a you, the air as a you, to express the gratitude we feel to be alive, but to do so in a key that inspires and draws us together instead of divides us or finds a way to push back on some who like words and some who don't like words. It's a way to bring us together. What do we mean by a blessing? What do we mean by liturgy? Well, a blessing in theory could mean blessing from above, supernatural. I feel blessed. But we also say when somebody sneezes, bless you. And we don't mean any miracles or magic. In Hebrew, the word for blessed, baruch, has one of its etymologies in the word berech, knee, like your body, your knee. The idea that you're kneeling, there's sort of a passive side to it. And so some early secular Jews didn't like the word baruch. They felt it was too obsequious, too groveling. So they chose na'eh ha'or ba'olam. Pleasant is light in the world, or our life on the world. Others were comfortable understanding baruch as a sense of a passive voice. May it be blessed, may we be blessed, may we feel blessed, independent of any supernatural intervention. I'll bet you 99% of the secular and humanistic Jews in the world do not say a blessing every time they eat bread. I'll bet you most Reformed Jews don't say a blessing every time they eat bread. The function of the blessing is communal. When we gather together to share food, to share Shabbat, that's when the blessing has a role. It creates community, articulates the values of community, and it gives us both an emotional uplift and an expression of who we are. So our blessings are not going to be the blessing for everything under the sun, the blessing for seeing a rainbow, and the blessing for seeing a multitude, and the blessing for getting out of the bathroom, and the blessing for, which actually exists, and a blessing for specific kinds of foods with specific blessings. We don't care about that detail. It's rather a sense of the emotional uplift, fitting that emotional need that community building is created by not just digging into your food right away, but waiting, breathing, singing together. What do we mean by liturgy? Liturgy, again, could be the fixed words that everybody has to say at the same time, decreed by the religious authorities. Liturgy could also mean the words that bind us together, like the ligaments of religion, right? The liturgy are the shared words that express who we are. It can be fixed, it can be flexible, it can be different for different times and places. You don't have to say the same thing every week or every month. There are many ways to express communal feeling and to celebrate holidays. So I always try to encourage people to learn more than one version of a blessing, of a Shema, of an articulation of values, because you should understand you may not feel about saying it the same way every time. The last word, or two words I guess, related to each other. The words prayer and worship. I'll often get people who ask me, so do you say the prayers? I always ask them, which prayers are you talking about? Because actually, if you think of prayer in the sense of a request, the Kaddish isn't a prayer. It's a praise. The Shema isn't a prayer. It's a statement of belief. And a promise of what will happen to you. If you read the later paragraphs, it says if you follow the rules, you'll live and be rewarded. And if you break the rules, you'll suffer and die. That's not a prayer. In the sense of aspiration, hope, what you desire. You may know that nationally there's something called the National Day of Prayer. It was a law enacted, I believe, in the 1980s. It was a way to distinguish ourselves from those godless communists over in the Soviet Union. So obviously still relevant. And the desire was that the president annually would declare a National Day of Prayer on the first Thursday in May. It's always religious. It's never talking about prayer in terms of expressing human desire or articulating gratitude. It's always, we should pray to God, capital G, for His blessings from above, and all the conventional language. Now, some years ago, the American Humanist Association decided to create a counter event to the National Day of Prayer. They called it the National Day of Reason. And their goal was to emphasize science and learning and rational thought. And I always thought it was sort of a misdirected counter program. Because first of all, it's very insulting to people who do like to pray. Right? We have the Day of Reason and you have prayer. AKA prayer is irrational. It's not nice if you want to get them to work with you on environmental issues or social justice issues to go around calling them irrational all the time. The second challenge was that reason is not really the humanist counterpart to prayer. If anything, it would be action. Don't just pray, do something. So the most inclusive event would be a National Day of Prayer and or action. Right? You want to pray? Fine. You want to do. You want to pray and do? Even better. Let's do things that we can do to improve the world. And I'm very pleased that I proposed this a number of years ago, and this last year it was picked up by a large national organization called the Secular Coalition for America. They encouraged secular humanist and atheist groups around the country to participate in a week of action, which leads up to the National Day of Prayer. And they got over 100 different local groups to do some kind of community service activity as a way of saying, this is how we are meeting that human need to want things to be better. Not just sending words up into the sky, but putting our deeds out in the world. That's how we understand prayer. If prayer is a hope, we can hope, but if we want hope to be real, we have to work to make it real. So that's how I respond if someone says, do you pray? I don't pray the way you mean it. I work and I do. I do hope, but I don't just hope. I remember once I was answering a survey, and I love answering surveys. This was around election season. And after asking my opinions, they asked some demographic background, income and age, education, that kind of thing. And they said, does the clergy at your religious institution talk about political issues? And I had to think, do I? Since I'm the clergy. They said, how often do you attend services? All the time. How often do you pray? Never. I'm sure the survey results sort of jumped out of them. Something's off here. But there was an accurate depiction of what I do. The last piece about liturgy, and then I want to open up for some comments and questions and get to the last topic, is we need to be at least somewhat culturally literate in what goes on in the broader Jewish world. I've heard stories of early humanistic Jews who would go to other synagogues and say, oh, they sang Na'aseh Shalom wrong. Because they sang it as Oseh Shalom, and that's not how we do it, and they must be wrong. Well, that's like knowing the punchline, but not knowing the joke. You know, you don't know where this came from. So there's a level of cultural literacy that being aware of those texts and where they come from and how they evolve is important to understand the conversation in the broader Jewish world. So we want our kids growing up in our schools to know that Baruch Atah Adonai formula, not to recite it fluidly in every form, but to be familiar when they go to other synagogues and other parts of Jewish life to know what other people are doing and why we've made the changes we did. You might have noticed in the service booklet where I had Na'aseh Shalom, I had a little italicized paragraph there that explained what we changed from the traditional version. And that's for people who are secular who don't know differently, and for those who are religious and are wondering why we changed it. Now we can explain and people can be on the same page of why we're singing it this way. It's important for cultural literacy. And as I said, it helps you get the jokes. So I do have a joke about the Kaddish, and we'll end with that, believe it or not. So in a very large synagogue, it's so large they have to run two Yom Kippur services, two Rosh Hashanah services simultaneously. It's a Reform synagogue, so they're a little bit flexible on the rules of what counts as work. In this case, the senior rabbi has just hired a junior rabbi, and he tells the junior rabbi, here's how we're going to handle the division of services. I'll be in sanctuary A, and you'll be in sanctuary B, and I'll send the cantor with you in sanctuary B, just because you'll be nervous, and I understand, so he'll be there to support you. But it's very important that you time your sermon to be exactly 25 minutes. Because what will happen at the end of the sermon is the cantor will begin reciting the Kaddish, Yitkadal, Yitkadash, and he'll do it over the loudspeaker system so it plays in both sanctuaries at the same time. So as long as we both end our sermons on time, there'll be no problem, everyone will hear the Kaddish on time. Time comes for the service, and inevitably the junior rabbi gets nervous, and he rushes through his talk a little bit, and he ends at 22 minutes. And the cantor begins to sing, Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah. Well, after the service, the senior rabbi is livid. He says, you made a fool out of me. The junior rabbi said, what happened? What did I do? The senior rabbi said, I had just gotten to the peak of my sermon. I said, some of us out there say that God is dead. And what do we say? And then we hear, Yitkadal, Yitkadash. Again, you need to know the traditional to get the joke, but that doesn't mean you are required to say it yourself. Okay, so I want to take just 5 or 10 minutes for some questions, comments, reactions, and then get into our last topic for our morning session. Yes, we do include Hebrew as part of our instruction. The question is about our Sunday school and educational program. We teach Hebrew as a language. So we want them to know some vocabulary, some conversation, to be able to read the letters and pronounce it. And many of them do a bar of mitzvah that involves a Torah reading, so they have to know Hebrew to read for that as well. Even the ones that choose a topic will do some Hebrew poetry reading or otherwise, because we want them to be literate in Jewish language. You know, even Yiddish uses Hebrew letters. Ladino uses Hebrew letters. So to be able to feel comfortable in other Jewish settings, basic literacy is important, so we made it a requirement for our program. The commentary is that many Hebrew school programs only teach you how to read. They don't teach you what you're saying or what they mean. Maybe that's by design. They don't want you to think about what they mean. But also their focus is on Hebrew as tefillah, as prayer, and not as lashon, as a language. Our focus is, yes, they should be fluent to read at a reasonable speed. They're not going to be as fast as people that do it for more days and more hours a week, but also to have some comprehension of what's being said. That's a choice of emphasis that we've made. The balancing act is, you know, we get them for a few hours a week. We get them on Sundays, generally. We used to do an extra day during the week, and that even has faded, so now we add an hour on Sunday. But you're not going to learn a language 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours a week. When you study a language in school, you do it 5 days a week. And even that doesn't work because you have to go to the country and live in the language for a period of time for it to really sink in. You're just not going to learn a language fluently in the amount of time that our families are willing to devote. But if you can introduce it, make them able to read, basically literate, have some vocabulary, then perhaps they can pursue it later. Some high schools in our area actually offer Hebrew as a foreign language if children choose to learn it, or they can have an Ulpan experience in Israel. At least make them familiar with and literate in the words and the language. But when it comes to creating our services, I never assume that people are able to read the songs. You may have noticed all of the songs that were in the service have the Hebrew letters, for those who like to or are able to read those, and what's called transliteration, written in English letters, for those who may have never learned or may not be as fluent in it. Certainly if you have intermarried families, the non-Jewish partner can't be expected to have studied Hebrew in their church Sunday school. So we want to make sure everyone feels included and accessible and able to sing what's being sung. And even in some cases where we have a singable translation that isn't really a literal translation, I'll sometimes add in the small italicized text, here's what it actually means in the non-English language, so everyone should know what they're saying and what they're singing. For us, it's a combination of the continuity with the past, the nostalgia, the associations with Hebrew language and letters, but also the satisfaction of knowing that what I'm saying and singing is what I mean to be saying and singing. So you get both at the same time. The question is about repeating services. And I will confess, I don't make something brand new every time. We have a cycle of about 20 or so services that I've created, and we rotate through them over the course of the year. So in any given year, you'll probably have a service once or maybe twice, and then the next year it'll probably show up again, depending on what the themes I'm talking about will be. But I don't want it to be exactly the same every week. At the same time, there are some pieces that are similar every week. We always do a wine sharing as part of a service. We always light Shabbat candles as part of a service. We always have a memorial reflection as part of the service. We'll often do a Joys and Concerns candle lighting, which is a Unitarian ritual. We make it Jewish by calling it something Jewish. So we call it Simchas and Suras. Simchas are joys, Suras is difficulty, but people can stand up and light a candle to celebrate something great, or to remember someone who's deceased, or to offer concern for someone who's ill or facing a difficult time. We have a congregational menorah with 7 lights that we use for that lighting, so it adds to the Jewish flavor of the practice. And people look forward to it. It's a ritual, it's a routine, but it's a routine that's different every time because the people lighting it are saying different things and for different reasons. So that's where I encourage it to be flexible, but also to be familiar. After all, if I brought in brand new songs every week, nobody would sing because they wouldn't know the songs. You have to repeat some. So you'll find Hini Matov in a lot of our services, Yevenu Shalom Aleichem, Nasi Shalom in a lot of the services, so that people have a chance to sing together, as well as to learn something new. So again, having that Let Us Light These Lights song last night was new. It took a couple verses for people to get it. The Shalom Aleichem might have been familiar, but new words. The second time through, I could hear the volume increase because people learned it. And then the songs you already knew, people sang more loudly. So I want to find the balance between keeping it interesting and varied, and keeping it familiar enough that people can participate and understand and feel connected to what's going on.
So you write the sermon, the service.
I create the services, sometimes using poetry other people have written. I don't write everything from scratch. And I don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've been doing this in secular humanistic Judaism for 50 years now. We have a huge archive, an online archive in most cases, of other services people have created. And I can borrow and cite and give other resources there. You're not on an island doing it if you're part of a movement that's been doing it for a long time. It's a different skill than just taking out the prayer book and reading page 1. But I think it's a valuable skill, and I think creates a meaningful experience for people too. So the question is, how does a group manage when you've got a lot of different experiences and perspectives? Some come from an Orthodox background, some Reform, some conservative. They have different melodies, they have different texts they're attached to. Some are more flexible on questions of vocabulary, some are less. How do you create community out of that? And that'll be the theme of my talk tomorrow as well. I call it herding catses. How do you create community out of a lot of different Jewish perspectives? Having a committee is a good idea. Having a committee that's open to feedback is a very good idea because it's not their service, it's the community's service. Includes people of diverse perspectives. Don't only recruit people to the committee who represent those different audiences in the community so that their voice is part of the conversation. Also, I think it's useful to reinvent the wheel a few times. Don't let the first version of what you made be the permanent version forever. If you're doing it on photocopy paper anyways, it's not that expensive to do it again, or to be open to change. Even having a town hall meeting about what do you like and what do you don't. Some of it is going to be an aesthetic conversation. Some people love responsive readings, some people hate responsive readings. Some people love moments of silence, it could have them go on for 5 minutes, and some people fall asleep during moments of silence and would have 5 seconds or less. Part of the bridging experience, I think, is also getting people used to the fact that different people have different needs, and maybe one part of the service won't speak to you, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be about you all the time. If you want a synagogue or a congregation that does what you want all the time, you will have a congregation of 1, or maybe 2, but it won't be this big. So there's a sort of a flexibility to cultivate in people to get used to that process. And the last option, and this is something that some communities do, even in the other movements, is they have different styles of services. So 1 month they might do a more, quote, spiritual service. It has more meditation, instrumental music, more reflective poetry. And then they'll have another service that's a more intellectual service that has more prose and more philosophy and more sort of declarative mode, and the topic of discussion will be more in that vein. And you make sure to advertise it so people know what they're coming to if they come to it. But that might be another way to provide some space for people to feel that their needs are met. It is important to come up with a consensus, though, of what the boundaries are. You know, if you're a community that has no boundaries, then you're not really a community. You're whoever talks the loudest. And part of defining a community with an ideology is sometimes saying no. It's easier when you've got a rabbi who could be the heavy, you know, the bouncer who does that. But I don't think of my role that way either. I'm a guide, and I can articulate what the shared values of the community are in part because we develop them together. And then that gives me the right and authorization to occasionally say no when someone wants to add something that would be beyond the consensus of what the community can do. So it's a long process to do. And the last point is, this is maybe beyond the scope of the workshop, but if you're part of this larger movement, you're not alone in doing that either. We have staff, we have expertise, we have other communities that have done this that you can draw on. See what kind of guidelines they've drawn on. See how they work their committee process to reevaluate services. Talk to the rabbi at the Society for Humanistic Judaism about what she would recommend for a process to go through this. Even to help guide it, or design a weekend experience like this specifically focused on that topic. All those are possibilities opened up by being part of that larger movement instead of feeling like you have to do it all yourself when you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, so the question is about what is this larger movement I'm talking about? In 1960, well, in the early 60s, the first congregation called the Birmingham Temple was founded. And within a few years, there were a number of other congregations that started. In 1969, the Society for Humanistic Judaism was founded with 3 congregations, one in Connecticut, one in Chicago, and one in Detroit. Now there's about 26 communities across the country of varying sizes, some larger, some smaller. This congregation would be probably in the upper third in terms of sizes, because we have smaller chavarahs as well. They formed by people who heard about the message and wanted to create something, and wanted the support of an umbrella organization to foster that. In 1985, we started the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism to train rabbis, publish materials, provide weekend learning experiences like this, do the intellectual work for the movement. And as I said, we started our rabbinic program in 1992. In that program, we've ordained, I think, about 12 rabbis in that time frame. We also have other rabbis who were ordained elsewhere who shifted over into humanistic Judaism, just like members of this community shifted from other branches of Judaism. Rabbis do that too. And we also have an Israeli rabbinic program that started in 2003 that's ordained a number of rabbis there as well. So we see ourselves as a worldwide movement, and we have tried to articulate a message that speaks for more than people who are actually literally members of our community. I hear a story all the time that drives me crazy. People will say, "Oh, I felt like this for years, I finally found you." It drives me crazy because we've been here all those years and they didn't find us. Now, part of that is our problem in messaging, part of that is their problem in not having Google to search for things, but also not even imagining that something like this could possibly exist. It wasn't even in the conceptual framework, so they didn't even know to look for it. So I like those stories that they found us, that's good. Would have been nice if they found us when they were looking for us earlier on. And hopefully the more communities we have, the more rabbis we have, the better our presence is on the internet and in other places, the more people will find that this is a meaningful approach for them. You know, that 23% that say they don't believe in God but still identify as Jewish, some of them will be comfortable in other synagogues, that's fine. But some of them are not comfortable there. And they could be better affiliated with us than with any of the other options out there. Yes, please.
In the past, I know that the Institute also trained lay leaders.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't referenced that, and I'm wondering if that still exists and if you might talk about
We do. We do have a program to train, they're sort of like quasi-clergy. You can think of like a deacon in a church where they're not a full priest, but they can do weddings and help community services. That's a program that was called the Madricha program, or Wegweiser in Yiddish. One of the challenges was we knew we wanted to call it the leader program, to train leaders, but the word in Yiddish for leader is Führer. Can't use that. So we chose Wegweiser, which means the person who knows the way. So in Hebrew, Madrich has derech, the path in it. The problem is that in many circles, Madrich means camp counselor or tour guide, so it's not perfect either. But the goal was to train people with weekend seminars at a less rigorous level than the rabbinic program to serve communities that are mostly lay-led, but maybe would pay someone, 10 hours a week to do this kind of work. And they're trained in counseling, in community management, in education, in holidays and life cycle events, in Jewish history, and our basic philosophy, being a spokesperson for the message. And that program actually started in 1985. We trained something like 45 or so of those leaders. That program still exists. It's much smaller than it used to be, in part because the pent-up demand for that was met with the leaders that were trained, and in part because we found it tougher to sell people. Either they wanted to be the full rabbi program, or they wanted to just do an adult learning class one at a time and weren't interested in pursuing a full program. The other program that we just started last year is a life cycle officiant program. You may know that you can get ordained on the internet for 15 bucks and get a certificate from the Universal Life Church or the Church of Dudism or a number of other places, and you can legally do weddings now. So to make someone go through a 4-year full-time program to be a rabbi, if all they want to do is life cycle ceremonies, feels like not just overkill, it's a hard sell. So we created instead an officiant program where they take a class in our basic philosophy, a class in life cycle ceremonies, a class in counseling involved in life cycle events, and a practical experience of shadowing someone who does these ceremonies to see how they're made and created. And then we'll put them out there as a life cycle officiant to be able to do those weddings and so on. And we have, I think, 4 people in that program currently. It just started this past year. So those are the 3 programs we have: the rabbinic program, the Madrich leadership program, and the officiant program. And by the way, there's information on all these programs on our website. If you go to iishj.org, which is the Institute's site, and we have some literature on the back table as well, you'll be able to find out more about who we are and what we do. So the question was, how many people actually understand the Hebrew?
That's correct.
And if you don't understand it, maybe you don't care. You can translate it however you want, and it doesn't matter what the Hebrew says. I think that there's a couple of factors to that. I mean, one of the things I'm going to talk about with your board on Sunday afternoon is that maybe it's worth doing a congregational survey. That would be one of the questions to ask in that survey. Do you read Hebrew, and what's more important to you if you had to prioritize between these 2 values, and get a sense of what the community's perspective is on it, because that'll help drive what kind of programs you do and services you make. But the other piece is that I wouldn't want to recite something in Arabic or in Swahili if I didn't know what it said, because I feel like the words have meaning, and if I'm expressing something that says this is who I am, and this is what I think, I want to know what I'm saying, even if I don't know the language. So just because one understands or doesn't, that may not solve the alienation issue vis-a-vis the traditional text. And the last point to keep in mind, and this can be tricky when it comes to defining a community, is accepting that different people are going to have different responses. I like to use the idea that there is no one correct thermostat setting. Okay? Inevitably, someone will be too hot, and someone will be too cold, and you'll hear about it. And there is no one correct thermostat setting. One of the most brilliant things I ever heard a church do was they assigned someone in the congregation every Sunday, just before the service started. He would walk up to the thermostat and do something with it. He actually never adjusted it at all. But what that told people was the ones that were too cold thought he was raising it, and the ones that were too hot thought he was lowering it, and everyone felt better. So there is no right thermostat setting. There is no one version of what the services will be that will meet everybody's needs. But part of the challenge of community is being sensitive to other people's needs. And so if you want a congregation that recites the Kaddish and the Shema regularly and does the Amidah, the standing prayer, those exist. There isn't an option for the people who want something else that's out there. Now, those other places may be more expensive. They may be more formal. They may have a rabbi you don't like. There's other factors involved too. But a secular and humanistic community is a safe space for those people who want to be more flexible with the liturgy, who don't want to recite just the old words just because they're old. And so sometimes that might be the line that the community draws about what it does and doesn't do, and they're allowed to do that too. So this is a balance of tolerance and having boundaries that this community will have to continue to discuss. So the last topic I wanted to touch on in our last 5 minutes is how changing what we focus on changes what we do. By shifting the focus of the holidays and the liturgy from above and beyond to who we are and what we do in this world and in this life, you can transform the holidays all kinds of ways. If you read the traditional Passover Haggadah, Moses almost doesn't appear. The hero of the story is the God of the Hebrews with the mighty hand and the outstretched arm, right? It sounds unfamiliar to us who've read liberal Haggadahs our whole life that talk about Moses and the Exodus story. It's odd to find Moses not there. So we can change the focus if we want to telling the story. We can also ask, did this actually happen? There was a rabbi in California named David Wolpe who got in trouble about 20 years ago where he was sitting at his congregational Seder. He said, well, we all know the Exodus didn't really happen the way it says in the Haggadah. What? Flip out. My favorite quote that was in the LA Times story about the episode was one of the congregants said, did he have to say it at the Seder? In other words, okay, fine, archaeologists say so and so. Do that in your adult ed class in the library with 20 people. Don't mess up my Seder by pointing out that it didn't actually happen. Well, but maybe our Seders can have simultaneously the story, as literature and values, and the history as what really happened. And talk about the archaeology and the evidence and what is and what isn't plausible to believe based on what we know. I can handle both of those truths at the same time, and that makes the celebration more meaningful for me. Because now, it's not just about what happened way back when, it's about what stories people told, and what meaning they got out of the stories, and how they changed the stories over time. How the Haggadah itself evolved to add in different passages and different prayers and different poems and songs. You know, Chad Gadya, that one little goat story, was added in the Middle Ages. It wasn't part of the rabbinic version of the story at all. And you can also know that because it's in Aramaic. It's not in Hebrew, which is a later language of Jewish life. So we can understand those layers, just like I talked about Hanukkah last night, how it evolved over time, the meaning of the lights changed over time. I like adding that layer of knowledge to the story. I'll puncture one more myth about Hanukkah for you while I'm at it. You know the dreidel with the 4 letters, right? Everyone thinks they know what the 4 letters stand for. Nes Gadol Haya Sham, a great miracle happened there. Well, actually, probably not. And I'll give you one clue to that. You may have heard the story in your Sunday school that the Maccabees were persecuted for studying Torah by the Greeks. And one of the ways they covered for studying Torah was they had the dreidel with them. So they would be studying and the soldiers would come in, they would pull up the dreidels and they would pretend to be playing dreidel. But what was on those dreidels? A great miracle will happen? Because this is before the miracle. This is before the rebellion. So something's off in the chronology there. We've also discovered archaeologically in medieval Germany a number of 4-sided tops with the letters N, G, H, and S on them. Now, were they copying the Jews? No. They made up a game. It's a game where you spin the top, and if you get an N, you get nisht, nothing. If you get a G, you get ganze, the whole thing. If you get an H, you get halb, half. And you get a shin, you have to stell ein, put one in, or shit ein, throw one in, but you don't say that anymore. It was the rules of the game in German. Guess what Jews were doing in medieval Germany? They were speaking medieval German, but writing it in Hebrew letters. So the origin of the dreidel letters is the Yiddish rules for the game. Nisht, halb, ganze, stellen. Later on, someone was very clever and came up with this Hebrew phrase, Nes Gadol Haya Sham. And now in Israel, they make them with a pei instead of a shin. Or Nes Gadol Haya Po, a great miracle happened here. But the real story is the letters and the rules of the game. That's part of our Hanukkah celebration. We talk about the evolution of the dreidel. It's interesting. It's the real story. And they get to know the traditional meaning for the letters too. But why not dig deeper? Make it about people. Make it interesting. That's what I think is most satisfying about a humanistic approach to Jewish life. It's relevant. It speaks to us in our experience. It's about people doing, making, living, adapting, trying to understand. I think that's how we articulate what the message means to us and how we express our values as a community in the shared words of literature, song, and celebration.